Good evening. Welcome to Tripping on Legends. I am your host, Christopher Balzano. I want to start off tonight by welcoming our new audience who is listening on midnight.fm. This is, we like to say, where it's always midnight. We are expanding kind of our audience, and we are hoping that they're willing to come along on this journey with us. Tripping on Legends is really primarily Florida focused, but as anyone who's had to spend time with me knows, once you get the stories going, you realize not only chances are that these stories are also found in your hometown, but that a lot of these ghostly legends that I talk about are going to be, they're going to extend beyond just a simple ghost story. We're actually going to talk a little bit tonight about that at the beginning. But this idea that what is happening in Central Florida, what is happening in South Florida, what's happening in the Panhandle, these small little towns are the same small towns that you grew up in, the same small towns you live in now. And we explore these myths and we explore these legends, not only to find out about the paranormal world, not only to find out about ghosts, but also to find out about who we are as people, what our community and our history is, and then kind of some universal truths. So I'm glad that we have the Midnight FM audience along with us. It's not going to change you guys. You guys can still catch the show, only now it's going to be consistent. Every Tuesday night at 9 o'clock, you can catch it. And if you are listening on Midnight FM, you can feel free to pop into the Tripping on Legends Facebook. Don't disconnect from Midnight FM. You can you can kind of stay in there, and you can actually participate in the chat room that we've got going because it's shared on Tripping on Legends. And all of you guys who are regulars in the Facebook Live, nothing will change for you guys. You'll still have to look at my ugly mug while I explore these things. And hopefully you guys can contribute to the show. So feel free to call if you want to contribute to what we're talking about tonight, either the first section where we're going to talk about how to tell a true ghost story, or in the second section where I get into a very specific legend of the Coyote Woman. If you have a legend that you want to share, or you have kind of some comments or commentary on the legend of the Coyote Woman that we're going to be looking at, feel free to pop on in. Feel free to call. The number is 813-418-6822. And remember, while you're putting that into your phone on speed dial and taking a nice picture of my face and putting it as your contact, that you can follow us on any of our social media platforms. So at Facebook, it's facebook.com/trippingonlegends. You can contact me at spookytripping@gmail.com, and Spooky Tripping is also our Instagram account, and we are on Instagram TV right now as well. You can also tweet us at Spooky Balzano. Do people use Twitter anymore? I'm getting more and more followers on Twitter, but I don't seem to see a lot of action going on. So shoot us out a tweet to tell us that you're still alive in this world. I wanted to start tonight by looking at the nature of ghost stories. And the nature of, I guess, more than an actual ghost story, the nature of the telling of ghost stories and how we communicate the paranormal that is something that we may or may not experience, right? And I think we need to make maybe a clear distinction, although the distinction is really cloudy and should be, between a ghost story that we experience and a legend or a myth that's told in our town, a ghostly story or an urban legend that's told in our town. Oftentimes we insert ourselves into that story, but it didn't necessarily happen to us, but it's something we've lived with, and it's something that we've become, as a listener of the story, and then as a repeater of it, we become a living, breathing part of that story, of that narrative. And so it's almost as if it existed to us, and that's kind of what we're going to explore in this first part here. So I loved, when I was in college, like my freshman, sophomore year of college, I was first exposed to, Dr. Strangelove. And of course, the subtitle of that is, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb, right? And that's supposed to be like the witty turn part. So this episode is episode 72, and it is, entitled tracking the Coyote woman, but the subtitle is, or How to Tell a True Ghost Story. Because in dealing with this story, and I had planned to talk about this already, if you'd listened to episode 71, we kind of began the discussion then. I had planned on talking about this already. And then I ran into a case this week that became a perfect example of what do we do when we come across a ghost story as storytellers, as folklorists, as writers, and just as tellers of stories. How do we get the details right? So if you know me at all, you know that this book, which is backwards on IG, but it's Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. It's probably the most single influential work of art that I've ever experienced. I had my students read it last year, and they were absolutely loving it. The highlight of my radio career, while I love being on Midnight FM and all the work I've done on Spooky South Coast and other shows that I've been on, my greatest moment was when I called NPR and made Tim O'Brien cry talking about his book. And it's a really powerful story if you've never read The Things They Carried. It's a collection of short stories which together act as one long story. So it's a novel kind of told in these short stories, which is kind of revolutionary at the time that he wrote it. And in this, and it's what they call metafiction. So it's a lot of it is having to do with how you write something and the importance of the telling of the story as much as the story itself. And there's one chapter in particular called How to Tell a True War Story, which is kind of the centerpiece of the book. It's not in the middle or anything like that. But I was rereading it today because I knew I wanted to, or at least I had in the back of my mind, this idea of how to tell a true war story, or how to tell a true ghost story. And I just kept running across the things that O'Brien talks about in this book, and specifically in this chapter. And I was like, all right, so let's see what's going on here with this. Let's see if we can make some kind of correlation to what is happening with a ghost story. I'm going to go over a little list here, and I'm going to relate it to ghosts. So it starts off by being whether or not stories are true. And as a folklorist, I'm not really overly concerned with whether or not a story is true, but it's kind of, we present these, they're engaging enough to us that they are true, and we kind of live with them being true. So a true ghost story is never moral, and it doesn't have a point. So when you communicate a ghost story to someone, or when you read a ghost story, you kind of want there to be a point behind it, right? It's a better story if there's a moral at the end. It's a better story if when you get to the end of the story, you feel as if something's been resolved, or you feel as if, for example, that the ghost is at peace, or the family, if you're from the living side, and that there's some kind of message. It's an uplifting message. It's a hopeful message. And a true ghost story is usually not like that, right? It's usually a series of events that happen to someone or a community, and there's no explanation. There's no logic to it. There's no purpose to it other than to exist, right? We put the importance on it afterwards. So many times when you hear a story from someone who's had a real experience, they tell you the story as if it were Aristotle's plot diagram, exposition, trigger, rising. I'm not going to bore you with it. But that's not the way things usually have played out, right? They've only kind of come to it afterwards. A true ghost story, one that's kind of like not invaded by anything else, doesn't have that. And it doesn't have a meaning at the end. Ghost stories are not fables. They're not, we throw on the word kind of interchangeably myth and legend and urban legend and folklore. And these are not really interchangeable terms, but they are for what we kind of do here. But they're not. In reality. In a true ghost story, what happened cannot be separated from what seemed to happen. And that is a huge deal and something that I deal with all the time. And when it comes to, so the real point of all of this is this idea of when do you have enough experiences to warrant it becoming a myth? Like, when are there enough moments, when are there enough instances when you can say now, like, oh, this place is haunted, or you have there's a ghost here, and it gets passed down from generation to generation. What happens oftentimes is people don't remember what they heard, and people don't remember what they experienced, right? But people don't remember what they heard. And tonight's story is going to be like a classic example of the story getting changed from generation to generation until it kind of falls on my lap. So you have to understand, like, if you're trying to communicate to that someone, is it important to identify that? Is it important that people understand and that you acknowledge in the story that there's a flaw in that, and I'm gonna pick at it a little bit, right? A lot of this was born out of me kind of working on the new book and realizing that most ghost books just seem to be carbon copies of the ones that came before. And that you can, and I know this is kind of jerkish to kind of talk about and kind of put out there because a lot of these people are my friends, right? And even me, it's more of a me issue. I was working on the book and I would probably be 2/3 done, and I was looking at it saying, like, I've read this before. I've read this book. I'm rehashing the kind of classic way to tell these stories. And it came upon me of, like, do people want that, right? Is there room in the paranormal? Is there room in paranormal literature? By paranormal literature, I mean like true ghost stories or myths and legends, not like a completely fictionalized account, for narrative, for style, for art. Can you experiment with it? Will people, as readers, accept that? Or do they just want it thrown out there? It's funny because when I did Haunted Love, coming out September 15th, when I wrote that, it was very easy because most of the stories were already done. I just had either posted them or I needed to switch them around a little bit, and I needed to do a little research on other stuff and fill stuff in. But they had taken on that kind of circle around the story, break it down, kind of tear it apart. And of course, we don't know the fate of Haunted Love yet because it hasn't come out. But even that, as I'm writing this new one, it just was killing me. And it was that idea of, is it important to acknowledge, does the reader want to know that there's a flaw in this? Does the reader want to know that this ghost story might not be true, or does it take them out of it, right? So if you're building that line between what happened from what seemed to happen, does that lose you as an audience? When you're hearing a story, does it lose you as an audience? And I understand some of you guys might respond to this, because if you're listening to this show, you like as Margie says, breaking down the myth. You like that analysis of it. But if you're reading a ghost book and you purchase a book, and I've been accused in the past of not writing books that are scary enough. If you're looking for that, how does it impact you as a reader if then all of a sudden they start talking about all this other stuff? Like tonight I'm going to talk about, it seems as if this would be a Native American story. It's like, but it's so not, and here's why. Or here's why this story doesn't make sense. Does it pull the reader out of it? And the next one is a true ghost story. Can't be believed. The crazy stuff is true, and the normal stuff isn't. So I know that the person whose story this is in the chat room, and I'm not going to acknowledge her necessarily by name, but this idea that crazy stuff, the more unbelievable it is, the more it generally tends to be real, right? When people are, when they experience stuff that they truly cannot understand, that's when it feels as if you're talking about something that might have really happened. or something that does resonate and kind of connects with people. And of course, once it gets to myth time, all that stuff is kind of filtered out. So I was talking to this person who experienced a time slip, an abduction, and years later, 40 years later, 45 years later, there's still that question, right? There's still the question of what happened here. She was in Sarasota, and then all of a sudden, instantly to her, she woke up in the Ocala Forest. And it's a really crazy and makes no sense. And there was no precursor to it. And there was nothing that kind of signaled it. There was no flashing light. There was no, we had a premonition. And then they, in a very mundane way, they were able to get to town, get someone to pick them up. And then they never really, not only did they not really talk about it ever again, but also it impacted all of their lives. But there was never any follow-up, right? And so it's not as if there was some kind of revelation. That goes to the whole moral part, right? The whole moral of the story. There was no follow-up to it. There was no dream afterwards that connected it. There was no hashtag follow the signs. All of a sudden things that had happened were revealed, or there was a memory or anything like that. It's just this completely, in and of itself, like just there experience that had a very profound effect. Can't say very profound. Had a profound effect on the people who were involved in it, but there has no meaning to it, and there was no. It was a bubble, and that kind of leads to the next one. Which is a true ghost story never ends, never seems to end. The people who experience a true ghost story, and this is the one thing that is really hard to articulate in writing. And I wonder how much, and I struggle with how much to actually do this in the writing, because it's the thing that you feel as the person who told the story, but the thing that no one ever really will get. And that's this idea of that, like, the story never ends, right? So for the person who experienced that time slip, that story never ends for her, right? It's not necessarily on her mind all the time, but it's something that if she, she allows herself, or it pops in, or something reminds her, then it's there, right? Or, I did a story in Haunted Objects about a woman who had a St. Raphael pin, and the pin kept, or necklace, and the necklace kept appearing at the grave of both her son and her father. And she's telling me this story more than a decade later, and it still has an effect. That ghost experience, the big joke that we always say in Bridgewater Triangle world is that when people give their stories, oftentimes it's this happened to me years ago, right? It's not necessarily something that is completely, it's not new, it's not fresh. That's what the production companies hate. But there's this idea that, like, it happened a while ago, but it's still on my mind, right? And that's something that's really hard to convey in a fresh way. Years later, Joe still thinks about that night. Like, I've read that line. I've read that line 100 times. And I'm gonna read this quote because I love that, because I love this one, and then I'm gonna read you a quote. And I know that Natalie would kill me if she was watching this and she discovered that I was reading during an episode. But I'm going to I'm gonna try it here, and that is. You can tell a true ghost story by the questions you ask. Someone tells a story, and afterwards you ask, is it true? If the answer matters, you've got your answer. And that's kind of what I struggle with, and that's kind of what I deal with. This idea of telling a story, and wondering whether the audience cares whether or not it's true. Do you guys care whether it's true? Do you guys feel that if you want to get a story, if you somehow feel robbed, do you close it and finish that story and say, that didn't happen. That didn't, come on now. You know, and do you feel robbed if it doesn't, right? Like if you feel like you've lost something, that the story itself has somehow cheated you, if you get to the end and you're asking that question and you don't have the answer, right? We're all living in the shadow of New England Ghost Files, where at the end there was always that dun 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 part of the story where it was, and it ended up that his father had lived in the house, right? And you have this like, and I remember being so blown away by that, right? I remember being so engaged in that because it was clear cut, you know. And I have these narratives, and I struggle with how to communicate them, right? Because they are being they're being just recycled, and I wonder if we become. So I'd love a response to this, and of course you can feel free if you want to chime in on this at 813-418-6822. Whether we can get to the point where we lose what I call awe, and the story just becomes overly familiar. Like in folklore type, we kind of like that, right? We like a little bit of that familiarity. I guess you can say there's that drop. Oh wow, I wish I could remember what it's called. That idea that like it's true, and then boom, no, you've lost me because it's not. Like something happens, and we lose that sense of awe because we have seen it so much. We know what's going to happen. We know the way the story ends. You know, we talked about one of the reasons why I started tripping on legends and the approach that I take to it is that I, like many other people, had lost awe in the paranormal, right? I had lost this kind of like happy bewilderment, right? This idea of looking at something that is completely unexplainable, but it becoming so common that you no longer are in awe of it. You're no longer kind of wondering whether or not it's impactful. It's like, oh yeah, there's a ghost. And I think that people, I had to kind of switch to the thing because my comments aren't coming completely the way I want them to, but it looks like they are. I think we've done the same thing, and I think it's funny that all this is kind of happening at the same time. But Ella and we got a ghost book from the library about Florida because I wanted to see if there was anything new they could bring to it, piece of some history that I didn't know about some other places, and I just like to sometimes read other people. And I did a little test, and I said to her, "All right, I want you to open up to the table of contents, and I want you to." Just tell me the area, and I'm going to tell you the chapters. And I had like, at least a 75% success rate talking about what are the stories that are going to be in this ghost book. And it's not by someone that I know or anything like that. It was just a random book that I picked up. But it's there, right? It's there, and I struggle to communicate these stories because they get boring, right? They get boring. Not only they get boring, but as a storyteller, I lose my way as well. And so it's funny that I want to be fresh and I want to be new, and it's difficult to do that. And I think a lot of it has to do also with you guys, the readers. I think that you guys have a certain expectation of what a ghost book should be, and if it's not that, then it's like, yeah, that didn't really work for me. I always go to the story of I've called it the message. I've called it the polo shirt and glasses at different times, and I think it's one of the most profound stories I've ever been told. And it's essentially the story of a friend of mine whose roommate in college had died, and her roommate's boyfriend had died unexpectedly. He was like 20 years old, and it was horrific and it was horrible, and she had to live with it and she had to kind of deal with it. And the daughter, the the girlfriend, couldn't deal with it, and she would have these horrific nightmares. She thought were nightmares of him in the room trying to communicate with her, to the point that she had to have like the carpet torn up. Right, if he was lying on a chair, she had to have the chair removed from the room, and it really kind of disabled her life. And then it ends up that not only did the storyteller, to me, a friend of mine, but other people were having dreams or visitations by the same ghost, who was just trying to tell her he was okay, move on in the world. And I've always told that story in a different kind of way, and no one has ever connected to it. And I think it's like one of my favorite stories that I've ever told. And I tell it differently than I did with you guys, and I feel part of it is because there's a certain expectation, and even though it has that moral that I talked about, people just don't seem to connect to it as much, and I wonder why that is. And so I came across this story this week, and all of these things came flooding back, right? Because it's I came across a story. Someone contacted me with this story, and it's a perfect example of the absolute shit show that is the Ocala Forest. It is a story which, it's funny, the man's name is Taylor, and he's kind of young looking, if I'm going by his picture. I haven't deep dug his profile or anything like that. And he phrased it, I love this, it's just old folklore. I have no way to prove it. It's only hearsay around these parts. And that phrase, that hearsay around these parts, is really what stuck with me, because it was not something that a 20, 30-year-old says, around these parts, hearsay around these parts. And a few other times during the actual telling of the story, he falls into this old-fashioned narrative, which to me screams of being told the story time and time again, and being told by an older person and mimicking the way they say it, right? That's how we learn stories. That's how we pass down folklore, is by this oral tradition of it. And that's one of the really horrible things that I'm discovering, is that it's really different to give yourself that feel of oral, feeling of oral, give yourself that feeling of oral communication, right? That word of mouth legend aspect of things, even in a real ghost story. You lose that when you start to type it, right? It's almost as if I feel like rather than writing a book, I would rather have someone just like open up. I don't know why I'm going with this weird like old technology, like open up a book and it talks to them. You mean an audio book, Chris? Like where people just buy the audio file? Yes, something like that, where I could just, tell them or whisper in their ear and kind of have my eyes and have my my hand gestures. I'm Italian. Have my hand gestures communicate what I'm trying to say, rather than trying to put it into words, because sometimes the words don't work. And this is a great example of that. He tells me this story, and I don't know how to file it, right? I mean, so many of these, I talked about the time slip story earlier. I don't know how to make these things connect to each other, because it goes from one to another, and someone tells a story, and then they tell me 17 other things, and I'm like, I don't get what you're trying to say, but the connection is made in their head, right? And so it's like, do I just go straight forward with this narrative, right? Do I just go straight forward and be like, here's a story, here's a thing? Or is it like one of those things, and normally I don't swear, so it was kind of like, it was that intense that I needed to swear. Or do you start with how wrong this legend probably is, or do you get into it? So I'm going to drop into storyteller mode, and I'm going to try, I swear. I feel like I need to have be tied up or something like that, or have someone here with a knife. Deanna always says, just let the story be the story. Have the knife right here, being like, if you go off, if you're still doing commentary, we're going to stab you. Because this is, I'm going to just try to do the story as the story. And then we'll get into everything a little bit later. So there's a town known as Rosewood, Florida. And it is an unincorporated section of Lake County, which no longer exists. Which no longer exists. And there's a off the road, and in the story, off Old Cemetery Road, there is a cemetery, which is pretty much abandoned. You have to go into the woods to get to it. It's overgrown. There are both marked and unmarked graves. And the story goes that generations ago, years ago, there was a 15-year-old girl who fell in love with a 17-year-old. And that 17-year-old boy happened to be black. The father found out about it. The father drags the boy into town and beats him half to death. He then drags the boy back into the woods, or into the woods nearby. Some people say that he dies from this. Others that he just leaves. But either way, when the young girl discovers what's happened, she immediately goes to the site where the beating happened. And there's blood everywhere, and she's absolutely horrified by it. And she doesn't, at this point, know what's happened to him, whether he's died or what's gone away. She's just kind of heard what has happened, and she sees blood all over the place. She goes home and finds her father's gun, which he has stashed in the nightstand. And when he comes home, he kills her. She kills him. Sorry, she kills him. And she goes back out into the forest. And she's covered in blood. She goes to the cemetery and she just cries and cries and cries. And eventually her sorrow and her grief and this crying that she does takes the form of, or the tone of a coyote. So she begins to sound like a coyote. She then lays on top of one of the graves and kills herself with the gun. The weird thing is that not only is her body never discovered, but it's said that she actually becomes a coyote. So during this horrific event, somehow her body is transformed into an actual coyote, and she lives forever. She is still to this day prowling the Ocala woods, the Ocala National Forest, and it says that she preys on people who enter the forest who are evil-spirited. So in death, she has this kind of job where she is, to some degree, protecting the forest. And if you go to that cemetery, not only will you see this coyote, and you can be judged as being worthy or not by whether or not she attacks you. But at night, in the area where this cemetery is, there is the sound of coyotes howling, but within that howl, you actually hear a woman crying as well. That's the story. I got through it. I only twice, I think, disappeared into commentary. But yes, that's the story. Does it make sense to you? What are the flaws that you see in this story? Where do you see the difficulty in trying to communicate this story to the public, right? Like, how would you tell that story? And of course, the whole itch of it is, the rub, if you will, is that it's not that simple, right? There are a lot of things going on. Taylor didn't tell me whether or not the story was true. He was very quick to point out that the cemetery exists and that he himself has heard the cries, right? That's actually a part I added to the story. He has heard the cries inside of the howl. And anyone who's been out in the Ocala knows that there are a lot of animals out there. I'm not sure if there are black wolves, Margie, but I do know that there are coyotes. There are a lot of bears, and so we're left with this story, and we're in that moment. We're like, all right, so like, what does it mean, and do people care what it means? And automatically, I am so glad you went there. Automatically, we're drawn to this story as possibly or potentially being Native American, right? Because we assume coyote, and coyote has a lot of symbolism in Native American folklore, Native American culture. It is this interesting combination of strength and cunning, right? So it's kind of got like the strength of something more powerful than it, or something, like a bear or something like that, but not quite there, not quite at that level. And yet it's got the cunning of like the fox, and this combination in almost all. And anyone who wants to talk on this can feel free to interrupt me. I talked to Dr. Starks about this idea that the coyote is somehow a trickster, right? And the coyote is there to cheat. It's there to get someone to do something that they're not willing to do, or to kind of like take advantage of people. None of which is in the story, right? So even though she starts to sound like a coyote, she doesn't have, like, there's no trickster element to it, right? So the coyote seems like a really odd element to it. I mean, it screams Native American, screams it. Like, this has got to be a Native American story. And I think that we've explored this idea before. For example, when we talked about Tomoki, when we talked about the story of the singing manatee river, this idea that there is an odd mysticism that America has with Native Americans, right? And this idea that you can take an element, like the elements of nature, like, oh yeah, like, I know, like those Indians, like, they're really connected to nature, so we're gonna make that, and you tell the story, and it doesn't make any sense, because this is not this Romeo and Juliet love story type thing is really, and feel free to correct me if you're wrong, if you can come up with another type story that predates it. This Romeo and Juliet, death, suicide, this kind of hashtag haunted love type of story is not in genuine Native American folklore, right? Like, you don't find it in stories that are passed down in like official books or official legends or official things. This idea of the parent not liking them, and so that's a European construction. That's a European thing. It doesn't seem to exist. If you can come up with a Native American legend that is a total Native American legend that has this element to it, and you can track it, that a Native American actually tells the story, feel free to call it 813-418-6822. But also, like, feel free to email it to me, right? Because we've come across this time and time again. But there is something, and Taylor doesn't connect it to Native Americans, but we, I think, as an audience, are like, wait a minute, like, that sounds Native American, like, right away. And of course, as I'm doing stories in the Ocala Forest, I'm coming across not only legends that have to do with the panthers that are really in the forest, and the bears that are really in the forest, but the idea of mythical animals, and obviously shadow men, things like that. We're going to do a whole episode just on shadow men, but also things that are kind of take on that. Like, I've even gotten a few things that may potentially be Pukwudgie related. So there is a history of that in there, and we want that. So it's kind of I don't think it's a Native American story, I guess, is what it boils down to. Instead, what it really is it's um, I think it's a much bigger commentary on race relations in Florida, and I think that it has to be acknowledged that that is going on here. It has to be acknowledged that this story is something more than just a simple tale told as two people are walking in the woods. A grandfather tells a grandson, or a father tells a dad, or kids tell and challenge each other. There's another element to it, because we are talking about the differences between those two people being that one's black and one's white, right? The dad doesn't beat up because he's 17. The dad tries to kill him because he's black. And we have to see that that's an element of the story that is really important for the retelling of it, because it has this, oh, we wouldn't be like that, we wouldn't do that today or whatever. But obviously, if you look at what's going on in the world today, in America today, we're still seeing this kind of stuff. Jeremy, the Hockomock and the Freetown and the Triangle is very much like what's going on in Ocala. You have this whole collection of things, and even there within it, you have this story that is kind of, talking about something deeper. That's oddly enough one of the things I always felt the Bridgewater Triangle lacked depth. That there wasn't necessarily bigger meanings in a lot of the stories. They were just so crazy that it added to the weirdness of it. So I started to discover, try to go down this rabbit hole. I wanted to tell the story, and I'm like, well, what is the town name, right? Because the town doesn't exist anymore. So what is the name of the town? And because it wasn't Rosewood, or if it was Rosewood, it didn't exist on any records whatsoever. So at some point, the town became known as Rosewood in the story. I really have a strong feeling about. There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that there might be some connection between the different rosewoods that are in Florida. That maybe it was just like Rosewood Plantation, and so people called it Rosewood. But he said, according to Taylor, that the town was destroyed by fire, which I am finding more and more whenever I look at these small towns in Florida, these boom towns that then get kind of destroyed and they get paved over or planted over. That so many of these towns are destroyed by fire. And obviously you can go on conspiracy theories, like these fires are so that the government can kind of take control of it again, or this, that people are doing it to profit from it somehow. But there are a ridiculous amount of fires that have ended towns or nearly ended towns in this Central Florida area. So I started to look at, I searched everything for days. I even posted on Historical Florida, the Facebook page, to try to get anyone who remembered this town or had ever heard of this town, which was kind of a really bad idea because no one was really listening to me in the group. And they kept giving me something that I'm going to talk about in a sec. But then I started to explore, because we've talked about a little bit this idea that in the Ocala Forest, people don't know where they are. That once they get into the forest, not only do they get lost, but they could be living someplace for years and not be able to identify where in the forest it is, or whether it's in the northwest, the east, south. Like where are you in the forest? I don't know. And so when he first told me the story, he essentially was placing himself on the east side of the forest, right? And so I found this other town that was called Ridgewood. So I'm like, all right, so maybe it's Ridgewood. And then I also found Rosebush, like all of these other towns that, could potentially be this town. And eventually he's like, nope, it's not that, it's not this one. It's actually more towards Astor. It's a town that's known as Paisley. And it's in Lake County, and it used to be part of the town of Paisley, but there is no record. It's kind of like Pemberton Ferry, in this town is myth. There is no record that this settlement existed, that it was ever, an area of it was ever called Rosewood, that there was ever anything that happened. And here's where it kind of turns. Because, as was pointed out, I kind of already knew this information, but as was pointed out erroneously, people kept saying, no, 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 you're in the wrong county. You're in the wrong county. You mean Levy County, Rosewood and Levy County, Rosewood and Levy County. What I think has happened instead is that the story has always been about a black boy and a white girl who aren't supposed to be together. And they are punished for their love. And I think that if not true, then it's at least supposed to be true, right? It's supposed to be a warning. And it's interesting. I was talking to an archaeologist last night. It's not supposed to be a don't do this. It's not a cautionary tale in terms of let's not ever be these people again. It's so much more. It's so much more about almost praise for the dad. I mean, if you think about this, the woman kills her father, and she's the one whose soul is kind of now bound to this earth, right? And so she's definitely the one who does the wrong thing. She kills her dad, and she kills herself, suicide bad, and like she's the one that kind of pays for it, right? I mean, she's crying. Like, she's fighting the forces of evil in the forest. Good luck. She's doing a crappy job with that. But this idea of that she's stuck and you can still hear her crying, none of that sounds very pleasant. None of that sounds very... It's almost as if that other part's tacked on. So it's always been about racial tension. It's always been about what's going on. And I think over time, as whatever that part of Paisley was called, as people forgot, as the land was taken back, the forest took over part of it. It was burnt down, and so therefore people moved on. In Florida, when these towns go under, it's either the town gets burnt down, or they literally pull up everything, like in Coon Hill. They literally pull the stuff out of the ground and go move it to another place. Instead, my theory is that the town name, over years and years of being retold, has borrowed or stolen the name of Rosewood, Florida. And the story of Rosewood, Florida, the actual story of Rosewood, Florida, is one that is maybe not as well known as it should be. Because we don't like it. We don't like that story. We don't like what it tells us about ourselves, because this story does not take place in ancient history. Instead, it takes place in 1923. There was an area, there was a town known as Rosewood, and it is most famous for something that is known as the Rosewood Massacre. And this was, like I said, in 1923. The official report is that 6 African Americans died and 2 white citizens died. But the real totals are more like somewhere between 50 and 100 people died in this. And it ultimately ends with essentially the wiping out of Rosewood completely. So here's your Tripping on Legends history lesson. And the odd thing is that, as far as I know, there are no ghost stories that are coming out of Rosewood itself. There's no ghost stories coming out of where this thing actually happened. But I have a feeling that this massacre is the spark for the name change, right? So people are talking about this area, and they're telling this story, and it's very simple. It's kind of like a mini version of racial tension, and over time, it just kind of takes on the name of Rosewood. So Rosewood was settled in 1847. Like many towns of that area, in that section of Florida, it was primarily like a lumber. It was a lumber and turpentine haven, right? So like a lot of the towns, they started to do the wood. They started to get turpentine from the wood. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, so now all the other businesses kind of build up around it. Until by 1870. So we're talking pre-Civil War, and right, a train depot is built, right? So it becomes populated enough that the trains are actually now going through. It's a stop, which of course brings a whole bunch of new business to it. And unfortunately, it, like many of the narratives of these towns, it goes under, right? The businesses start to fail, and by 1890, the mills are pretty much closed. And when that happens, the white people who had settled in the area leave. The black people who had settled in the area stay and kind of start to reopen the mills and kind of try to are running things until, from what I can tell, this town of Rosewood kind of becomes like a little bit of a mini powerhouse, right? And so a guy by the name, or the families are known as the Goins and the Careys. They're in power, and they kind of have control of this town, and the business is somewhat successful. Then on New Year's Day in, what did I say, 1923. So now we're talking post-Civil War completely. We're talking, pre-civil rights. But the racial tension in Florida, I don't think I need to tell anybody, is absolutely horrible. And if this sounds like something like the To Kill a Mockingbird, it is. And I wonder if it wasn't like maybe even the inspiration for some of it. So there's a white woman in Sumter County named Frances Franny Taylor, and she is assaulted, right? She is found beaten, and she says that a black man came into her house and beat her. Rumors start to spread, even though she denied it in her reports. Rumors start to spread that she was also raped, which kind of even intensified. Now, her launderer slash friend, a woman by the name of Sarah Carrier. She's like, it didn't happen that way. I actually saw a white man leaving out the back door. So you guys can kind of say whatever you want about that. But they decide that they need to find this man. So there is a character who's going to become pretty important in the book. His name is Sheriff Elias Walter. And this dude has got to be one of the most intimidating and sketchy characters in Florida history. Because it's funny, I was looking through the emails that I've gotten, and I have so many things that say, have you looked at Elias Walker? Have you looked at Elias Walker? And I'm like, no, not yet. He deputizes a whole bunch of people until, and some not, until over 100 people and dogs go out to find it. And so essentially what they do is they find this man by the name of Aaron Carrier, who's the nephew of Sarah, who they assume has done the crime. And so they take him to the jail, and oddly enough, Elias Walker kind of is protecting him. The mob, which is now kind of totally geared up, goes back out looking for another guy that they were kind of anxious to get their hands on. This part of the story is kind of sketchy for me. I don't really understand it all. But a man by the name of Aaron Carrier, so now we're talking, Sam Carter. They find him. He's shot in the face, and then they hang up his dead body. So there's, and then all of a sudden things just explode. And by January 4th, there's kind of this showdown of all these people at Sarah's house. They essentially, there's a shootout. They don't take the sheriff and the deputies don't take the house, but who knows how many people died. And they say that, and there were even kids in there. Kids might have died. And in the following days, they burn the house. They burn the town to the ground. And Rosewood is and should be this real stickler, right? This should be something that kind of all history classes, especially here in Florida, are being taught, and they're not. But it talks to the racial tension that I think is what the story kind of exemplifies. So it's this really weird thing of like, well, how much of that do you get into that history when you're telling that story, right? Does it become important? Does it become necessary to go down that path? You know, like I said, I was talking to an archaeologist last night, and I realized that, for the first 2 years of Tripping on Legends, it was hashtag haunted love, right? And all these stories we were getting were about love. And then when we went to Hog Island, thanks, thanks, Delia, when we went to Hog Island, everything seemed to shift. And all these stories now seem to be about racial tension, about the issues that black and whites have in Florida. And it's tricky ground to walk on. It's tricky ground to maneuver in the times that we're in. Because how do you tell that story? And is it true? And do you take the story and put it out there and let others make the point, or do you connect it forward? Do you connect those dots? That's what I'm dealing with. You can actually follow all of that kind of fun, good stuff, because no one likes racial tension better than me. I mean, all I want to do is tell a ghost story, but it's impossible to separate them. You can follow all of that great material by following Tripping on Legends on Facebook at trippingonlegends.com. I'm sorry, facebook.com/trippingonlegends. You can actually go to trippingonlegends.com to get the same kind of information, as well as following us on Instagram at Spooky Tripping, and on Twitter at Spooky Balzano. And of course, now you can subscribe to the archives of midnight.fm. And not only will I be putting old episodes of Tripping on Legends on there, but you can also get all the other amazing shows that they have there. And the subscription kind of helps pay for some really amazing paranormal content. And you can get it, and you can kind of just listen to midnight.fm all day long. As well as you can get my podcast free anywhere. Maybe I'm going to put up some special stuff for the midnight.fm listeners to make it worthy, because, I'm, I guess, worth the subscription in and of itself. So there's a million ways to follow us. There's a million ways to get involved. I ask all of you guys to call, text, tweet me, whatever you can, telling me your legend. It doesn't have to be about Ocala, and it doesn't even really have to be about Florida. It just has to be interesting, and of course, hopefully, it also has to be a really great legend. Or if I've struck a chord with you tonight and been like, wait a minute, I have that exact same story that happened in my town. I want to hear it, and I want to hear what your town is. So, I am Christopher Balzano. You've been listening to Tripping on Legends, and here's hoping that all your trips are legendary.